The long house of the Iron Fang pack was suffocatingly silent. The heavy oak doors shut tight against the howling northern wind. Inside the great hall, the air smelled of burning pine wood and old sweat. Alpha Valerius Ashvale stood before the massive hearth, his towering figure cast in long, flickering shadows against the stone walls. His silver hair caught the amber light of the dying embers. His sharp jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked. He was a commander who ruled by absolute decree, a man whose calculations never faltered. Except tonight. For 14 years, Valerius Ashvale had lived with the arithmetic of a terrible choice. He had stood on the stone steps of this very hall and told his people that a fever had claimed his mate, Luna Yvain Ashvale, and their young daughter, Ilara Ashvale. It was a lie, beautifully packaged in grief, accepted without question by a pack that obeyed his every whim. The truth was far more dangerous. Weeks before that fateful night, an ageless, pure-blooded lichen messenger known only as the Emissary had arrived under the cover of a blue dawn. The Emissary had brought a revelation that threatened the very foundation of Valerius Ashvale's sovereignty. Luna Yvain Ashvale had not been an ordinary wolf. She was the unrecorded daughter of the late King Aldrich II.
Hidden away to protect her from a royal succession war.
This meant that young Ilara Ashvale carried the purest royal lichen bloodline on the continent, a bloodline that, by ancient throne law, completely superseded Valerius Ashvale's alpha authority. Faced with the loss of his crown and his absolute rule, the Alpha King had made a calculated decision. He banished his 6-year-old daughter into the frozen expanse of the Frostwood, ensuring his secret remained buried in the snow. But secrets do not die in the cold. They merely grow teeth. Outside the Longhouse, the peace of the territory had just been shattered. Marcus, a 23-year-old border sentinel, known for his unbreakable composure, had come sprinting into the courtyard, pale and trembling. He had collapsed to his knees before his alpha, his voice hollowed out by pure terror. "There is an army on the northern ridge," Marcus had whispered, his throat working convulsively. "Lichen banners. And the woman leading them? My alpha. She looks exactly like—" Marcus could not finish the sentence, but Valerius Ashvale did not need him to. The war drums of the Lichen Kingdom were already thundering across the ridge, a rhythmic, a terrifying sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the hall. Now, Valerius Ashvale stood alone in the center of the grand hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had convinced himself that the Frostwood would consume the child, or that some wandering rogue pack would adopt her far away from his borders. He had never prepared for her return. The heavy, iron-reinforced doors of the Longhouse suddenly groaned, the heavy latches throwing back with a deafening metallic crack that echoed off the high rafters. The wind rushed into the room, bringing with it a swirl of fine white snow and an oppressive scent that made the alpha's inner wolf claw at his subconscious. Through the threshold walked Ilara Ashvale. She was 20 years old now, but she did not look like the defenseless child he had cast into the wilderness. She wore heavy white wolf fur draped across her shoulders, over intricate silver-etched armor that bore the royal crest of King Aldrich II. Her face was a mask of cold, unyielding majesty.
She possessed her mother's pale amber eyes, but her father's stubborn, iron jaw. Beside her stood Doran, the loyal beta of the Iron Fang Pack, who had helped keep the secret of her banishment for over a decade. Doran looked withered, weighted down by the immense guilt of his complicity, his eyes downcast as he walked half a step behind the returning queen. Valerius Ashval stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. The raw power radiating from her was undeniable. It was the alpha aura of a true sovereign, a force so potent that the remaining guards at the perimeter of the room immediately dropped to one knee. Their heads bowed in instinctive submission to the royal bloodline. "Elara," Valerius Ashvale breathed, his voice cracking slightly, stepping forward from the hearth. "You survived." Elara Ashvale stopped in the center of the room, her amber eyes locking onto his with the precision of a predator. She did not strike with a blade, nor did she order the vast lichen army waiting outside to raise the stronghold. Her presence alone commanded the room. "I did," Elara Ashvale said, her voice smooth, low, and entirely devoid of the warmth a daughter should hold for a father. "And I have come to take what is mine." Valerius Ashvale looked at her, and for the first time in his long, tyrannical reign, he felt something akin to awe. The cold arithmetic of his past actions faded, replaced by a sudden, desperate ambition. If she was the rightful heir to the entire continent, if her bloodline surpassed all others, then uniting their power was the only logical path. He could make her his queen. They could rule the northern territories together, cementing the Ashvale name above all royal houses. "My Luna," Valerius Ashvale said, his voice dropping into a reverent, commanding tone as he closed the distance between them. "You have the blood of King Aldrich II. You belong on a throne. Forget the past. Rule this kingdom with me. Let me place the crown upon your head." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he attempted to touch her shoulder, to claim the bond of blood and lineage that connected them. But as he drew closer, the air in the great hall shifted drastically. A sudden, violent surge of dark magic pulsed through the room, emanating directly from Elara Ashvale's core. The air grew heavy with the suffocating scent of ozone and burning blood. Valerius Ashvale gasped, stumbling backward as an invisible force slammed into his chest. His veins burned with a sudden, agonizing heat. Elara Ashvale stood completely still, her eyes shifting from amber to a terrifying deep crimson. A heavy, dark aura swirled around her like a shroud of black smoke. Inside her chest, Alpha King, a romantic a secret war council of the ancient Lycan elders had secretly woven a horrific blood-killing curse into her very soul before she marched. It was a failsafe, a weapon designed to drain the absolute life force of any mate or alpha who attempted to claim her, turning the sacred mate bond into a conduit of pure, agonizing death. She had felt the spark of the mate bond trying to ignite the moment she stepped into the hall. She felt the ancient magic trying to bind her destiny to this man, to force her to become the Luna of the very pack that had discarded her like trash. But Elara Ashvale had not returned for a crown of submission. She had returned for justice. "Do not touch me, Valerius Ashvale!"
Alara Ashvale roared, her voice echoing with the power of 1,000 wolves, vibrating the stone walls of the longhouse. The Alpha King fell to his knees, clutching his chest as the curse began to wrap its icy fingers around his heart, pulling at his life force through the tenuous threads of the bond. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and betrayal. "Ilara, please," he choked out, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think you can cast me out into the snow to die and then call me your queen when it suits your ambition?" Ilara Ashvale spat, stepping forward, looking down at him with pure disdain. "You are no king. You are a coward who trades his flesh and blood for a title." She reached out with her right hand, her fingers curling into a tight claw as she channeled the full, agonizing weight of the blood-killing curse. She did not allow it to consume him entirely. Instead, she gripped the metaphysical threads of the mate bond that connected them, the sacred, instinctual link that every shifter held dear. With a scream of raw, unadulterated fury, Ilara Ashvale twisted her hand, violently tearing the bond apart. The severance fractured the air with a loud, thunderous crack. The spiritual agony of a broken mate bond ripped through the hall, a pain so intense it felt as though their very souls were being flayed alive. Valerius Ashvale let out a guttural, animalistic shriek of despair, collapsing flat against the stone floor, his hands clawing at the stone as his authority, his power, and his connection to her were completely severed. "I reject you, Your Majesty." Ilara Ashvale screamed into the rafters, the declaration sealing the rupture with a finality that shook the entire mountain. "I reject your pack. I reject your crown. And I reject the blood that flows through your veins." Valerius Ashvale lay broken on the floor, his silver hair matted with sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. He was no longer the absolute ruler of the northern continent. He was an ordinary man, stripped of his title, his mate, and his dignity by the very child he had thrown into the dark. Ilara Ashvale turned her back on him, her white fur cloak swirling around her ankles. She did not look back at the broken Alpha, nor did she acknowledge the terrified whimpers of the sentinels. She marched out of the longhouse, stepping directly into the raging blizzard that engulfed the courtyard. Behind her, inside the empty, freezing hall, the former Alpha King Valerius Ashvale let out a final, desperate howl of pure, unmitigated grief, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the roaring northern wind. The scholar stared at the silver-etched artifact resting against the map, his weathered hands trembling as he adjusted his spectacles. He was a man confronting something he had previously considered purely theoretical, a myth locked away in the royal vaults. "My mother," Ilara Ashvale said, her voice dropping into a register that made the candles flicker against the tent canvas. The scholar looked up at her over the lenses, his gaze shifting from her sharp, unyielding jawline back to the pulsing pendant. His lips moved slightly, reading the ancient runes carved into the metal. Ilara recognized that motion. She had seen it before when he worked through difficult, forbidden texts. He was decoding a truth that had been buried in blood. "Sit down," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Tell me what it is," Ilara commanded. She did not stir. She stood like a statue sculpted from the winter itself,
her white fur cloak draping over her silver-etched armor. "Sit down, child, because what I am about to tell you will not be improved by you standing." She sat, her movements fluid and lethal, the armor clinking softly in the quiet of the command tent. He told her everything. "A soul key," he explained, his voice thick with the gravity of centuries, was not a common thing. It was not decorative, nor was it ceremonial in the superficial sense. It was forged once by a supreme lichen king for a singular purpose, to mark a bloodline heir who could not be publicly claimed due to the fires of war. The runes were not decorative script. They were a living record, encoded with the pure lineage of the one who forged it and the one it was forged for. They activated, he continued, leaning forward until his shadow swallowed the map, in proximity to an anchor, an ancient lichen bloodstone. The kind buried deep beneath the founding structures of the old pack territories to mark supreme sovereignty. "There is a bloodstone buried beneath the Iron Fang Alpha's hall. You have been moving toward it for 3 days, Alara." Ilara looked down at the pendant in her hand. The pale amber light within the metal was moving slow and steady against her palm, pulsing in tandem with a heartbeat she hadn't known she possessed. "My mother," she said. The word came out level. She kept it level deliberately, suppressing the raw, jagged edges of a girl who had been discarded like refuse. Yvain Ashvale was not simply a wolf with lichen ancestry, the scholar said, folding his hands flat on the table. The soul key carries the sacred sigil of King Aldrich II. It was forged to mark his direct heir. His daughter, who was removed from the royal line in infancy and hidden among the northern packs to protect her during the Great Succession War of that era. The tent became utterly, suffocatingly quiet. "Your mother," the scholar said, with the gentle precision of a man who has delivered catastrophe before and knows that clarity is kinder than softness, "was the lost daughter of the lichen throne." Ilara said nothing. Her amber eyes, identical to the late Luna's, remained fixed on the glowing runes. "Which makes you," he continued, his voice wavering slightly under the weight of the revelation, "not merely a claimant. Under the right of ember and ash, the unbroken law that has stood for centuries uncontested, you are the primary heir. You stand above the War Council, above the appointed succession." He hesitated for the first time, the candlelight catching the deep lines in his face. Above the current king? Ilara rose without a sound and walked out into the freezing night. She found the black lichen standing at the eastern edge of the ridge, where the tree line thinned and the Iron Fang Valley opened below like a jagged wound in the dark. He was standing alone, his towering, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the distant fires of the packlands. The sight of him told her he had already heard. News traveled fast between a scholar's tent and a king who had placed that scholar 2 tents away from his own for 14 years. She stopped beside him, her white fur catching the wind. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The valley below was lit with the cold, defensive fires of a pack that wasn't sleeping, a pack that could feel the storm gathering on the horizon. The bloodstone beneath Valerius Ashvale's hall was pulling at the pendant against her chest, like an iron tide pulling at a ship that had been adrift for too long and finally recognized the shore. "Did you know?" she asked. She did not ask when he knew or how long he had kept it. Just those 3 words. The black lichen was quiet for 3 full seconds. In 14 years of survival, she had learned to count his silences, the way a traveler counts the distance between lightning and thunder, measuring the violence of what was coming by how long it took to arrive. "Ilara," he finally spoke, his deep voice vibrating in the winter air. "Yes or no?" she countered, her tone sharp enough to cut the wind. The wind roared through the black pines below them, carrying the faint, distant scent of iron and wood smoke. He turned to look at her, and his golden eyes held something she had very rarely seen in them. It wasn't guilt. It was something older, heavier than guilt. It looked like the expression of a commander who had made a calculation he could not fully defend, knowing from the moment he drew the line in the dirt that the accounting would eventually come. He didn't answer. His silence in that frozen moment was the loudest sound on the ridge. The pendant pulsed once against her chest, slow, deep, like a heartbeat that had finally found its true rhythm. She closed her leather-gloved hand around it, cutting off its light, and said nothing else. She did not raise her voice when she returned to the camp. That was the thing about Ilara Ashvale that most people never understood until their throats were already cut. She did not need volume to command a room. She had learned during the long, brutal years of becoming the vengeful Lichen Queen that rage is loudest when it is perfectly contained. She had learned that the most devastating thing you can do to a person who has wronged you is to remain completely utterly calm while you take them apart piece by piece. She walked back into the center of the camp and told the sentinels to clear the command tent. She sat down in the heavy timber chair at the head of the strategy table, folded her hands over the map of the Northern Territory, and waited. The black lichen came in 2 minutes later. He ducked through the tent entrance, a slight, habitual movement she had once found almost endearing in a different version of this life, and straightened his massive frame. He looked at her and said nothing. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. He sat. 3 years, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a measurement. It was the exact same tone she used when calculating supply lines or estimating border distances. Precise, impersonal. Focused entirely on the reality of the nunger rather than the bleeding wound attached to it. His jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under his dark skin. Yes. The royal archives were unsealed 3 years ago, she stated. Yes. And in those archives, she paused, not from a surge of emotion, but with the particular care of an executioner, making sure the blade was perfectly aligned. You found the documentation confirming my mother's lineage, her true identity, the soul key registry, the right of ember and ash as it applies to her direct descendants. Yes, she looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away, because they had never been the kind of people who blinked in the face of ugly things. And they were not going to become those people tonight. Tell me why, she said, her voice dropping an octave. And do not tell me it was complicated. I have navigated complicated since I was a 6-year-old child thrown into a frostwood blizzard by Valerius Ashvale. Try again. The black lichen remained still for a moment that stretched long enough to feel like a confession. When he spoke, he did not reach for the polished language of the royal courts or the careful architecture of a prepared defense. She would have seen through both in under a sentence, and he knew it. What came out instead was the raw roughness of a warrior telling the truth without knowing if it would destroy him. I watched you for 3 years before I ever found that documentation, he said, his golden eyes locking onto hers. I watched you build yourself into something that had absolutely nothing to do with what you were born into. Every rank you earned in my army, you earned it bleeding in the mud without anyone knowing your name. Every wolf who follows you down that ridge does it because of who you are, not because of a crown or the accident of your birthright. He stopped, taking a heavy breath before continuing. I found the archives in the dead of winter. You had just come back from the northern campaign. You were exhausted, your armor was cracked, and you were satisfied. For the first time in all the years I had known you, you were genuinely at peace with what you were building with your own hands. The tent was entirely quiet, save for the crackle of the iron brazier. I held a document in my hands that would have changed everything you understood about yourself, he said, and I thought, You thought? Alara interrupted, her voice dangerously soft. I thought that if I told you then, if I handed you a throne reason when you had only ever had a justice reason, I would lose the version of you that was doing this for the right things. He met her eyes squarely. I was afraid you would become about the crown, Alara, and I did not want to watch that happen to you. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, the camp moved through its quiet, disciplined rhythms, sentinels rotating at the perimeter, wood settling in the fires, the distant, low murmurs of wolves who trusted completely that the leaders in this tent had everything under control. They did not know that the 2 people inside had just cracked the foundation of everything they had built over 14 years. Alara looked down at her hands, resting on the map, then at the pendant, still radiating a faint, insistent warmth against her chest. She traced the distance on the parchment between where they sat and the Iron Fang longhouse, where the bloodstone was still calling to her blood like a funeral bell that had been rung and would not stop. Do you know, she asked, what the years before you found me were actually like? He said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt a question she hadn't finished asking. They were years in which I believed with absolute certainty that I was not worth keeping, she said. She spoke without an ounce of self-pity, her voice flat and factual, the way a scout states geography. My father looked at me, weighed me against his pride, and chose his throne. My mother was already dead. I was 6 years old when I walked into that blizzard, and I told myself I would survive it simply because the alternative was proving Valerius Ashvale right. She paused, her knuckles whitening against the table. That is not a story about resilience, Kale. That is a story about a child who had to forge a reason to live out of nothing because every single person who should have provided one had failed her. She looked up, her amber eyes burning with a cold, terrifying light. And you, for 3 years, had undeniable evidence that I was not nothing. You had proof in your hands that I came from something extraordinary. That Yvain Ashvale was not just a weak woman who died too soon, but a king's daughter. That I was not the discarded mistake of a frightened alpha, but the heir to a dynasty centuries old. Her voice did not shake. It simply became sharper, the way a blade becomes infinitely more dangerous the stiller you hold it against a throat. And you decided that I was not ready to know? The word ready landed between them like a heavy iron weight.
The black lichen closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, exposing the raw truth. "I was afraid," he said. "Not of the throne, and not of the politics." He looked at her with the unguarded honesty of a man who had run out of any other currency to offer. "I was afraid you would leave before you were ready. That you would go back to Iron Fang for the wrong reasons, before you had built enough of yourself to survive what going back would cost you." He said nothing else. He had placed his entire heart on the table between them. It wasn't a defense, and it wasn't an excuse. It was just the truth of a man who had made a choice out of love and gotten it catastrophically wrong, and he knew it. Elara looked at him for a long time. The lantern between them burned low, casting long, monstrous shadows against the canvas walls. The map beneath her hands showed borders and territories that would look entirely different by this time tomorrow. She stood up. She did not tell him she forgave him. She did not tell him she understood. She did not grant him the absolution he wasn't asking for, but that she could see he desperately needed beneath his steady exterior. She walked to the tent entrance, stopped, and kept her back turned to him. "In the morning," she said, "I will need you at my left shoulder. Be there." She walked out into the dark. The black lichen sat alone at the strategy table for hours after she was gone, staring at the empty space across from him. Outside, the warmth of the pendant was moving away from him through the snow. He had not lost her. But he understood with the agonizing clarity of a leader who has narrowly avoided a disaster of his own making that the space between not lost and kept was something he would spend the rest of his life earning back. Marin had not slept in 3 days. It wasn't fear that kept her awake. She had outlived most of the things in this world worth fearing. And the ones she hadn't outlived yet, she had made her private peace with long ago in the quiet hours of her cottage. It was anticipation that held her in its grip, the tightly wound alertness of a person who has been holding a heavy secret for 14 years and can finally feel the moment approaching when she can set it down. She sat by her small window in the blue, freezing hour before dawn, wrapped tightly in a gray wool cloak that had been old when she was middle-aged, and watched the northern ridge. The fires of the lichen army were visible from her cottage if you knew exactly where to look through the black pines. They were small, disciplined, and numerous, the fires of a force that understood the art of waiting. She had been watching them since they first appeared, and each time she looked, the knot in her chest settled a little more. Piece by piece, the way a long-disturbed thing finally comes to rest in the dirt. A messenger arrived at her door just after the first light broke over the snow. It was a young wolf, 17 at most. One of the scouts who ran the secret whisper network that threaded through Iron Fang's underbelly like a second circulatory system. These were the wolves loyal to the old ways, to the Elder Council traditions that Valerius Ashvale had quietly and systematically dismantled over 2 decades of consolidating his absolute authority. They were not rebels. They were simply people who remembered that there had been a right way of doing things before Valerius took the throne. And they had kept that memory alive, the way you keep an ember alive in a torrential storm, carefully, quietly, with both hands cupped around the heat. The boy delivered his message in 4 words, exactly the way she had trained them to speak. "She is at the ridge." Marin nodded slowly, handed him a sealed envelope in return, and watched him disappear back into the safety of the tree line. Then she turned back into her quiet home, walked over to the stone fireplace, and moved the heavy iron grate aside. She pressed the worn stone in the floor beneath it, in the a complicated sequence she had used perhaps 100 times over 14 years, checking, maintaining, making sure everything remained exactly as she had left it. The stone released with a dull click. The narrow earthen steps descended into the dark. She picked up her oil lamp and went down into the secret room. The chamber was small and completely dry. She had dug it herself 20 years ago with the help of 2 pack women who were now dead, women who had understood. As Marin understood that there are things worth burying and things worth preserving, and that wisdom lies entirely in knowing the difference. Along the left wall sat a cedar chest. Inside it, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth against the dampness of the earth, lay the truth. There were letters, a journal, a folded document sealed with Abeda's official mark. And beneath all of it, a smaller bundle, wrapped in fine linen, the kind of careful, a gentle wrapping you give something you expect another person to unwrap with trembling fingers. Marin sat on the low wooden stool she kept down here for this exact purpose, and she allowed herself, for the first time in over a decade, to open the journal. Yvain Ashvale had written in a small, precise hand that betrayed absolutely nothing of the terror or emotion behind her words. That had always been the late Luna's way, containing enormous, world-shaking things in careful, disciplined language. The way a river contains a violent torrent within the discipline of its banks. The early entries were unremarkable. Observations of the seasons, small records of pack life, notes on Alara's early milestones, and the ordinary texture of a life that looked from the outside like it was enough. But the entries from the final months told a radically different story. Marin did not need to read them. She had memorized every stroke of the ink years ago, but she read them now anyway, because Alara would need to hear her mother's voice. And Marin was a woman who believed in absolute preparation. I have known for some time that Valerius is afraid of her, Yvain had written 6 months before her death. Not of who she is now, but of who she will inevitably become. He has always understood the cold arithmetic of power far better than he understands people. And what he sees in Alara is a kind of power he cannot control, contain, or direct. She is not his heir. She is her own thing entirely, and that terrifies him to his core. And then, 3 pages later, in the entry that had stopped Marin's breath the first time she uncovered it, the words burned against her ribs. I have written to Marin. She will know what to do. I cannot arrange the whole of her escape. I do not have the time, and my body is making that clear with increasing efficiency every morning. But I can arrange the beginning. I know what Valerius will do when I am gone. I know because I know his fear, and I know that frightened men always choose the same cowardly way out. So I will choose first. Marin will send word to the Lycan border runners. When the time comes, and it will come sooner than Valerius plans, and faster than he expects, there will be someone watching the eastern woods for a small girl walking through the snow. She will be angry with me one day when she understands what I have set in motion. Good. Anger is energy. Anger means she survived. I would rather she be furious and alive than peaceful and dead in this den of wolves.
My darling girl, my impossible, serious, extraordinary Ilara. I am sorry I will not be there to see what you become.
I think it will be something none of us have words for yet.
Marin closed the journal, holding it tightly against her chest as a solitary tear tracked through the wrinkles of her cheek. Then she placed it carefully back into the oiled cloth.
Beside it, she added the beta's confession, Doran's handwriting.
Shaking heavily at the edges in the unmistakable style of a man writing against his own rotting conscience, naming every crime. It detailed the dates, the locations, and the precise, brutal words Valerius Ashvale had used when he made the decision to throw his daughter into the jaws of the winter forest. Finally, she placed the letters containing Yvain's secret correspondence with the Lycan border network, all encoded in the old Elder cipher that Valerius had never bothered to learn because he had always considered the traditions of the Elders beneath his absolute attention. It had been his single greatest tactical error. She wrapped the entire bundle in fresh, clean linen and tied it with a heavy cord she had kept specifically for this moment, a deep red cord. The color of the ancient witness tradition. It meant, I saw this crime, and I kept the truth pure. She climbed back up the earthen steps into the light of her cottage. The second messenger arrived at mid-morning, a stern, an efficient woman from the older network runners who showed no surprise when Marin extended the package. Tell her, Marin said, placing the bundle firmly into the woman's hands, that I kept everything. She paused, her voice catching for a split second as she considered adding a personal message, before deciding that some things could not be delivered by an intermediary. No, just tell her that. She will understand. The runner nodded once and disappeared into the snow. Marin stood in her doorway, looking out at the northern tree line. She thought about Yvain, a dying woman who had spent her remaining months on Earth, not on grief, but on architecture, building a flawless trap out of the time she had left, and trusting an old midwife with the weight of it. More than anything, she had trusted that her daughter was exactly what she believed her to be. Stubborn enough to survive the frost, strong enough to build an army, and clear-eyed enough to recognize the difference between a betrayal and a plan. The fires on the ridge burned steady against the morning sky. Yvain Ashvale had set this vengeance in motion 14 years ago with a single letter and a whispered prayer. Tomorrow, her daughter would march through the gates of the pack that had tried to erase her name from history, and she would be carrying her mother's ghost in her hands. Ilara left the army on the ridge at dawn. There was no grand announcement and no military ceremony. She simply rose before the camp had fully awakened, dressed in her pristine white fur and silver-etched armor, tucked the linen bundle Marin's messenger had delivered beneath her arm, and began her descent. The black lichen was already awake. She had known he would be. She had heard him stop pretending to sleep the very moment she stirred in her tent. She felt his golden eyes burning into her back as she passed the outer sentinels and started down the steep, snow-covered slope toward the valley. She did not turn around to look at him, but she had kept her promise from the night before. He remained at her left shoulder at first light, watching over her from the ridge. She was asking him to stay behind now, without uttering a single word, and he was letting her go without raising an argument. That, she reflected, was the closest thing to an apology either of them was going to manage before the blood settled. The walk took 20 minutes through the biting cold. The dense frost wood began to thin as she descended, the black pines giving way to the wide, cleared fields that bordered the outer gate of the Iron Fang territory. It was a massive structure of timber and reinforced iron, old, deliberate, and built to impress neighboring packs as much as to contain threats. Ilara had absolutely no memory of it from the night she was exiled. She had been a terrified 6-year-old child, and the world had been nothing but darkness and screaming wind until her father pointed into the trees and told her to run. Now she walked out of those exact same trees in the brutal clarity of daylight. She stopped 10 feet from the heavy iron gate and waited. She did not have to wait long. Word of her approach had reached the longhouse before she was even halfway down the slope. She had counted on that. She knew the border sentinels, led by the terrified Marcus, would run the moment they saw her break from the tree line alone, her silver crown gleaming in the winter sun. The gate did not open with the slow, mechanical weight of a formal greeting. Instead, it swung back with the sharp, urgent motion of a ruler who needed to see a ghost with his own eyes before he could decide if his empire was falling. Valerius Ashvale stepped through the threshold. He was flanked by 4 massive wolves, his remaining inner guard. The hardened fighters who had survived the attrition of challenges and the ruthless loyalty testing that came with his long, tyrannical alpha ship. Behind them, a crowd of ordinary pack members began to gather, murmuring in hushed, terrified tones. Word was ripping through the Iron Fang territory, like water bursting through a cracked dam. And the people were drawing toward the gate the exact same way they had gathered in the courtyard 14 years ago when the child was banished. Without being summoned. Some events pull a pack together by sheer instinct, requiring no command. Valerius walked 3 paces past his guard and halted in the snow. He looked at her. For one terrible, suspended moment, his mind refused to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. Ilara watched the calculation happen in real time. She watched his gaze move across her face with the cold, assessing scrutiny of an alpha analyzing a military threat, cataloging the details of her armor, measuring her posture, calculating the risk. He saw the rare white fur cloak, the pristine silver armor, and the heavy lichen headpiece resting on her brow. To him, she was a young woman, an unaligned danger, a powerful commander backed by the terrifying army visible on the ridge above. He was almost all the way through that tactical calculation when something snagged in his throat. She watched the recognition hit him the way you watch a fracture snap through thick ice, slow at first, then entirely catastrophic. His eyes locked onto her face, tracing the sharp lines of her jaw, mapping the precise shade of pale amber in her eyes. They were Yvain's eyes. They were the eyes of the hidden royal line, eyes he would recognize in any light, in any lifetime, until the day he died. And then, the face of Alpha King Valerius Ashvale did something that none of the wolves gathered at that gate had ever seen it do in his 20 years of absolute, terrifying authority. It broke. It did not twist into anger, and it did not harden into denial. It collapsed into something raw, hollow, and infinitely more honest than either. The involuntary shattering of a man who had been maintaining a monstrous lie for so long that the moment the truth stood before him,
There was absolutely nothing structural left to hold him up.
His jaw moved soundlessly, his lips parting as he tried to find a name he had buried in the frost. His eyes, which had always been iron flat and completely unreadable to his subjects, filled with a desperate, pathetic grief he could neither contain nor hide. He stood there in the freezing mud, stripped of his grand illusions, and looked at his daughter. And Alara Ashvale looked back at him with the terrifying, absolute stillness of a queen who had spent 14 years in the dark, practicing how to give him absolutely nothing he hadn't earned. The Grand Council doors of the Iron Fang Fortress did not simply open. They groaned under the immense weight of centuries-old oak and forged iron, vibrating with the volatile tension that held the entire Northern Territory in a chokehold. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of ozone, burning pine wood, and the raw, oppressive aura of dominant wolves. Alpha King Valerius Ashvale stood at the absolute center of the dais, his towering silhouette framed by the roaring hearth fire behind him. His silver hair caught the amber glow of the flames, casting sharp, predatory shadows across his iron-carved jawline. For 2 decades, his word had been law, an unyielding absolute that had crushed rebellions, settled territorial blood feuds, and bent lesser alphas into broken submission with a single glance. He was a ruler who calculated his kingdom in cold arithmetic. A man who had never permitted a single shred of emotion to compromise the absolute stability of his reign. Yet, as he looked down the long, stone-stepped length of the hall, the legendary composure of the Alpha King was visibly fracturing at the seams. Standing in the center of the flagstones, completely surrounded by the tense, shifting perimeter of the royal guard, was Alara Ashvale. She wore no silk, no jewels, no garments befitting the hidden royal lineage that had recently been unearthed from the ashes of secrecy. Instead, she stood wrapped in the stark, heavy white wolf fur of the frozen northern ridge, her silver-etched armor bearing the deep, jagged scars of the brutal wilderness. Her amber eyes, identical to those of her late mother, Yvain Ashvale, burned with a devastating, absolute stillness. She was no longer the voiceless, discarded child thrown into the indifferent maw of the Frostwood 14 years ago. She had returned, not as a beggar, but as a sovereign force, flanked by an ancient lichen host that answered only to her blood. Valerius Ashvale took a step forward, the sheer force of his presence causing the flagstones to seem to vibrate. He set his jaw, drawing upon the deep, resonant power that had commanded councils and broken armies. When he spoke, his voice carried the crushing weight of an alpha command, designed to force absolute physical obedience from any wolf who dared stand against him. "Kneel," Valerius Ashvale commanded. The syllable dropped like a falling iron gate, vibrating with a dominant frequency that demanded immediate submission. Alara Ashvale did not flinch. She did not lower her head, nor did her knees buckle under the immense psychological pressure of the king's aura. The heavy silence that followed her defiance was deafening, punctuated only by the aggressive crackle of the fireplace behind the throne. "You are standing within the absolute borders of Iron Fang territory," Valerius Ashvale said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, lower register, attempting to compensate for the glaring lack of effect his command had yielded. "You will submit to the sovereign law of this pack, or you will be declared an active hostile against the crown. I was born within the borders of this very territory, Elara Ashvale replied. Her voice was not raised, yet it cut through his oppressive aura with the clinical precision of a masterfully honed blade slicing through silk. It did not rely on brute volume. It relied on the undeniable truth of her existence. And you systematically erased me from it. Therefore, I believe we can collectively agree that your territorial laws possess an extraordinary amount of flexibility when it comes to my presence. Around the perimeter of the hall, the elite guard shifted their weight, their handspans tightening instinctively on the hilts of their long swords. Marcus, the young border sentinel who had first witnessed the terrifying approach of the Lycan vanguard from the northern ridge, stood near the heavy pillars, his knuckles white against his spear, his breath hitching in his throat as he watched the unfolding catastrophe. "This is your final warning," Valerius Ashvale rumbled, his silver hair catching the flickering candlelight as his fists clenched at his sides. "No," Elara Ashvale said softly, her amber eyes locking onto his with absolute certainty. "It is yours." Slyly, deliberately, Elara Ashvale reached beneath her white fur cloak and withdrew the ancient silver pendant that had once belonged to Yvain Ashvale. The old pack midwife, Marin, who stood hidden among the elders in the shadows of the gallery, let out a collective breath, her frail hands trembling against her wool cloak as she recognized the heirloom she had spent 14 years keeping secret. Elara Ashvale raised the silver chain into the dim, smoke-laden light of the hall. She did not know the exact ancient mechanics of what would transpire next, but she felt the legacy of Aldrich II pulsing within her veins. The runes engraved into the silver face of the pendant began to blaze. It was not a faint, flickering luminescence. It was a blindingly pure white silver light that poured from the metal like a torrent of liquid starlight that had been held under immense pressure for over a decade. The light erupted upward, structuring itself in the cold air of the great hall, projecting a massive, luminous Lycan sigil directly above Elara Ashvale's head. It was the primordial mark of the royal bloodline, a sovereignty that predated every modern pack tradition, every territorial border, and every alpha claim on the northern continent. The resonant frequency of the sigil rippled through the room like a physical wave, striking the bones of every wolf present. It was not a force that compelled them through tyranny. It was a cosmic frequency that their blood recognized. One by one, starting from the back row of the assembly, the hardened warriors of the Iron Fang Pack dropped to a single knee. Their human minds tried to comprehend the sudden shift, but their wolves had already surrendered to the true royal bloodline. Even the inner guard wolves looked at one another in utter bewilderment before two of them sank to the stone floor, completely unable to resist the ancient authority radiating from the exiled maid. Valerius Ashvale stood entirely alone on the elevated dais, the sole figure remaining upright as his entire base of power dissolved into a sea of kneeling subjects within a span of 30 seconds. The theater of dominance he had spent a lifetime constructing had been completely shattered by the mere presence of his daughter and the legacy she carried. Elara Ashvale lowered the pendant, letting the blazing sigil slowly dissolve into the rafters. leaving the air charged with the ozone scent of a recent lightning strike. She looked up at the silver-haired king, her face completely unreadable. "This illusion is finished, Valerius Ashvale," Ilara Ashvale stated, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "What you are attempting to project is nothing more than a desperate manipulation to maintain a crown that no longer belongs to you. You tell your pack they answer to pack law, but which law justifies the monstrous lie you told 14 years ago?" From the midst of the kneeling crowd, a weathered woman, a veteran of the border patrols who had served during the era of Yvain Ashvale, stood up. Her voice was trembling but clear. "Pack law told us she died of a fever," the woman said, looking directly at the king. "I stood in this very courtyard 14 years ago and wept for the child of our Luna. I placed mourning stones at the edge of the woods. Now she stands before our throne, breathing and powerful. Which part of your law covers the betrayal of our trust, my alpha?" The silence that followed was suffocating. The deep, resonant weight of a pack, realizing their entire reality had been constructed upon a foundation of absolute deceit. Valerius Ashvale's jaw tightened, his chest heaving as the invisible bonds of his absolute authority began to unravel completely. The alpha bond only holds when it is forged in absolute honesty, Ilara Ashvale said, stepping forward until she reached the edge of the long oak table that separated the dais from the lower hall. She reached into her cloak and produced a heavy, yellowed parchment. It was the final confession of Doran, the loyal beta who had carried the dark secret of her banishment to his early grave. A man whose body had literally withered under the immense weight of his accumulated guilt. Ilara Ashvale handed the document to the border sentinel woman. "Read it," Ilara Ashvale commanded. "Read every single word aloud, so that the foundation of this house can finally hear the truth." The woman's voice echoed through the high stone rafters, reading Doran's meticulous handwriting. The confession spared no one. It detailed the exact night the emissary had arrived at the castle, delivering the catastrophic news that Yvain Ashvale was the true heir of King Aldrich II. Meaning Ilara Ashvale's bloodline would legally supersede Valerius Ashvale's authority the moment she came of age. It described the cold, calculated arithmetic Valerius Ashvale had employed to protect his throne, choosing to cast his 6-year-old daughter into the freezing jaws of a winter blizzard rather than surrender his crown. He did not look like a man performing a necessary duty, the woman read, her voice cracking as she reached the final lines of Doran's letter. He looked like a tyrant, destroying his own blood to save his pride. I have lived in the shadow of that lie for 14 years, and I would rather face the judgment of the ancestors with the truth in my hands than continue to serve an alpha built on a grave. When the reading ceased, the silence within the great hall was the loudest sound Ilara Ashvale had ever experienced. It was not an explosive, angry roar. It was the profound, terrifying quiet of 1,000 wolves processing a fundamental recalibration of their existence. Valerius Ashvale looked down at the parchment, his eyes wide, his absolute composure completely gone. Without the performance of his absolute power, he looked older. The lines of his face deeply etched with the hidden gravity of the crime he had committed. He looked at Alara Ashvale, his lips parting soundlessly as he searched for words of justification, authority, or political maneuverability, finding absolutely nothing that could withstand the heat of the truth. An hour later, the Great Hall had been completely cleared of the pack, leaving only the two of them standing across the massive oak table where decades of territorial policy had been decided. The fire in the hearth had settled into a steady, intense crimson glow, casting long, dark shadows across the ancient tapestries. "Did you suffer?" Valerius Ashvale asked. The question did not come from his alpha register. It was not the commanding, thunderous voice that had terrified the northern continent. It was a raw, hollow whisper, the voice of a man who had suddenly been stripped of his armor and left entirely exposed to his own conscience. Alara Ashvale stood perfectly still, her hand resting lightly on the pommel of her dagger. She had prepared herself for every conceivable variation of this confrontation. She had expected rage, denial, political excuses regarding the stability of the pack, or the cold mathematics of sacrificing one life for the survival of many. She had even prepared herself for absolute indifference. She had not, however, prepared for those 3 specific words, delivered in a voice that sounded remarkably like a father. She thought of the freezing dark of the frostwood, the way the sub-zero cold sneaks past the skin and settles deep within the marrow of the bone until you forget what warmth feels like. She thought of the absolute indifference of the winter wind, a vast, frozen wilderness that did not care whether a 6-year-old child lived or died. She thought of the grueling, agonizing 14 years she had spent clawing her way through the ranks of the Lycan Kingdom, earning every scrap of food, every piece of armor, and every drop of respect through sheer, unyielding willpower, completely unaware that she possessed a royal birthright. "Yes," Alara Ashvale said, her voice a clean, unembellished fact. "I suffered. I was freezing. I was entirely terrified. And I was alone in the specific way only a child can be alone when they realize the person who was built to protect them has chosen their own ambition instead. For a decade, I did not know how to exist without constantly waiting for the winter to finish what you started. But I did not die. And eventually, I stopped waiting for your frost to claim me. The suffering did not break me. It forged me into an absolute sovereign that you never deserved to call your blood." Valerius Ashvale closed his eyes, his broad shoulders sinking as if a physical weight had dropped upon them. He did not ask for her forgiveness. He understood, with the residual intelligence of a ruler, that there was no apology large enough to span the chasm he had created, and that asking for absolution would merely be one more selfish demand placed upon a daughter who owed him absolutely nothing. "The pack will require an orderly transition," Alara Ashvale stated, her voice returning to the formal. The deep, resonant voice of an American woman recounted the story of Alpha King, a romantic way. "You will be permitted to live out your remaining days within the borders as an ordinary civilian, stripped of your title, your authority, and your ceremonial status. You will have no further say in the destiny of the Iron Fang. That is an extraordinary amount of mercy compared to what you granted me." She gripped the iron latch, the heavy metal clicking with the finality of a courtroom gavel. Leaving the former Alpha King alone in the dimming light of the hall he had sacrificed his soul to keep. On the morning of the 3rd day, A sudden, unpredicted snow began to fall over the fortress. It was not the punishing, howling blizzard of her childhood exile. It was a soft, silent snowfall, the massive white flakes drifting through the windless air with an almost deliberate gentleness, blanketing the gray stones of the courtyard in a clean, untainted layer of white. The entire pack had gathered within the central square, standing in silent, organized ranks as the transition documents were formally brought forward. The old midwife, Marin, stood near the front, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of profound relief and ancient sorrow as she watched the true line of Yvain Ashvale finally ascend to the position that had been bought with so much blood and secrecy. Valerius Ashvale stepped out onto the high stone balcony overlooking the courtyard, dressed no longer in his majestic royal furs, but in the simple, unadorned tunic of a commoner. He looked down at Alara Ashvale, who stood at the center of the square, her white fur cloak dusted with the fresh snow, her silver armor gleaming beneath the pale winter sky. As their eyes locked across the distance, something profound and terrifying shifted within the air. The primordial cosmic force of the universe, which had remained dormant beneath the layers of trauma and exile, suddenly awakened with the violent intensity of an erupting volcano. A golden, visible current of energy flared between them, a radiant, unbreakable thread of light that snapped into place, linking their souls across the open space of the courtyard. The mate bond. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled wolves as the sheer, undeniable power of the fated connection washed over the entire territory. Valerius Ashvale stiffened, his amber eyes blowing wide as the ancient, instinctive recognition roared through his veins. She was not just his daughter, she was his fated mate, the missing half of his sovereign soul, destined by the ancestors to rule by his side as the absolute Lycan Queen. The desperate, overwhelming desire to claim her, to protect her, and to elevate her to the throne of the Iron Fang flooded his entire being, shattering the last remnants of his stoic isolation. "Ilara!" Valerius Ashvale cried out, his voice cracking with a desperate, raw passion as he took a step toward the balcony railing, his hands reaching out into the open air. "You are my mate! The ancestors have spoken! Stay and rule this kingdom as my queen. I will give you everything."
But Alara Ashvale did not move toward him.
Instead, her face grew deathly pale, her amber eyes widening, not with joy, but with an absolute, localized horror. Deep within her chest, beneath the silver pendant of Yvain Ashvale, a dark, malevolent crimson light began to pulse violently beneath her skin. The blood-slaughter curse. It was the hidden, catastrophic weapon that the corrupt war council had secretly branded into her soul during her dark years in the wilderness. A lethal, parasitic curse designed to lie dormant until the exact moment her fated mate bond was activated. The curse was a parasitic entity. The moment the bond was fully forged, it would act as an unholy conduit, rapidly and irreversibly draining the entire life force, magic, and soul of her alpha mate until nothing remained but a withered corpse. If she accepted him, if she allowed the bond to lock into place, Valerius Ashvale would be dead before the final snows of winter melted. Despite the monstrous crimes he had committed against her childhood,
Despite the 14 years of frozen torment she had endured because of his arrogance, he was still her alpha. He was still the protector of this pack, and her soul, fundamentally unbroken by the cruelty of the world, refused to allow a cold-blooded murder to stain her hands. Ilara Ashvale gripped her own chest, her fingers digging through the silver-etched armor as the opposing forces of the divine mate bond and the dark crimson curse tore at her internal organs. A sharp, agonizing scream of pure spiritual torment escaped her lips, vibrating through the silent courtyard. The pain was absolute, a soul-shattering agony that felt as though her very spirit was being cleaved in two by a dull iron blade. "No," Ilara Ashvale gasped, her vision blurring as the dark veins of the curse began to crawl up her neck. "I will not let them destroy you." She looked up at Valerius Ashvale, who was already running down the stone steps of the balcony. His face filled with a terrifying panic as he felt the initial, agonizing pull of his life force beginning to bleed across the golden thread. With a final, monumental exertion of her sovereign willpower, Ilara Ashvale summoned the ancient royal lichen blood of Aldrich II within her veins. She reached out with her metaphysical hands, grabbed the glowing golden thread of the mate bond, and violently, mercilessly snapped it in two. The spiritual backlash exploded through the courtyard like a kinetic shockwave, shattering the nearby ice sculptures and sending a violent tremor through the stone foundations of the longhouse. The golden light shattered into 1,000 jagged, dying sparks that dissolved into the falling snow. "I reject you, Valerius Ashvale." Ilara Ashvale screamed into the howling wind, her voice filled with a devastating, absolute agony that broke the hearts of every wolf who heard it. "I reject the bond. I reject the throne. I reject you, your majesty." Blood, bright and crimson, spilled from her lips, staining the pristine white fur of her collar as the rejection tore through her own soul, leaving a permanent, hollow crater where her faded connection had once lived. She did not look back to see the king fall to his knees on the stone steps, his hands clutching his chest as he let out a raw, primordial roar of absolute despair, a sound of a broken ruler who had finally realized the true cost of his past betrayals. Ilara Ashvale turned her back on the throne room, on the pack, and on the fated mate she had sacrificed her own soul to protect. She lunged forward, her body shifting into the majestic, powerful form of a massive white lichen wolf, and sprinted blindly into the gathering blizzard, disappearing into the white, indifferent dark of the frostwood, leaving the Iron Fang kingdom behind her in a state of permanent, sorrowful ruin. The freezing winds of the frostwood howled like a dying beast, driving thick, heavy blankets of snow across the borders of the Iron Fang territory. Marin stood at the very perimeter of the ancient courtyard, her gray wool cloak whipping violently around her frail frame. Her knees, deeply weathered by the passage of countless winters, throbbed in the bitter cold, but her focus remained unyielding. For 14 long years, she had carried a secret that weighed heavier than the stone foundations of the great longhouse. Now, as she watched the lone figure of Ilara Ashvale moving toward the tree line, Marin knew her long vigil had finally come to its end. With deliberate, trembling steps,
The old midwife approached the young woman who had just shattered the foundations of the northern hierarchy.
Marin reached beneath her heavy cloak and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and softened by decades of hidden custody. She held it out with both hands, offering it like a sacred relic to the exiled Omega who had returned to claim her destiny. Ilara Ashvale paused, her amber eyes catching the faint, flickering light of the distant courtyard torches.
She looked down at Marin's weathered hands.
Recognizing the quiet devotion of the woman who had brought her into this harsh world and secretly preserved her truth, Ilara Ashvale reached out and took the journal. It felt remarkably light in her hands, its physical presence far more modest than the monumental history recorded within its yellowed pages. There was no name inscribed upon the cover, no grand title to signal its importance. It did not require one. Ilara Ashvale pressed the worn leather against the silver-etched armor covering her chest, choosing not to open it beneath the scrutiny of the open sky. Some revelations demanded absolute solitude, away from the prying eyes of a broken pack that was still reeling from the day's upheaval. Marin's gaze softened, a profound sense of relief washing over her wrinkled features. She looked at Ilara Ashvale with an expression of pure, unadulterated closure. "She knew, Ilara," Marin said, her voice barely carrying over the whistling wind, but ringing with absolute certainty. The wise elder took a shallow, shaking breath. "My Luna knew exactly who you would become, long before Alpha Valerius Ashvale succumbed to his fears. Long before the emissary arrived with his devastating proclamations, and long before you were cast out into this frozen wasteland. Yvain Ashvale wrote your future in those early pages, back when your footsteps were nothing more than a stumble in the snow." Ilara Ashvale remained silent, her jaw tightening as the memory of her late mother flickered in her mind. "Your mother always said your wolf possessed a clarity that defied your age," Marin continued, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "She heard things the rest of the pack was entirely deaf to. And she was right. You have proven her right." Marin placed a firm, reassuring hand over Ilara Ashvale's fingers. A brief and disciplined gesture of affection from a woman who expressed love through duty rather than sentiment. Without another word, the old midwife turned and walked back toward her secluded cottage, leaving the young queen to face the quiet descent of night. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Doran found her standing near the ancient, snow-laden pine at the edge of the courtyard. The loyal Beta approached cautiously from her left side, maintaining a respectful distance, his posture heavy with the collective guilt of the Iron Fang leadership. He stopped beside her, allowing the silence to stretch between them as the snow accumulated on his broad shoulders. "Are you all right, Ilara Ashvale?" Doran asked softly, his voice stripped of the command it usually held. He did not offer a shallow inquiry about her comfort, nor did he use a generic phrase that could be easily deflected by a hollow reassurance. It was a direct question, requiring an equally raw truth. Ilara Ashvale looked out into the vast expanse of black pines, her fingers tightening slightly around the journal. "I do not possess the answer to that yet, Doran," she replied honestly. The Beta bowed his head, acknowledging the gravity of her words. "That is perhaps the most genuine answer this courtyard has heard in a generation." As the words hung in the frigid air, something profound shifted within Ilara Ashvale's chest. The rigid, defensive armor she had worn around her heart for over a decade loosened, if only by a fraction. She did not turn to look at Doran, but the tense fist of her left hand slowly uncurled, letting go of the invisible weapon she had been preparing to draw for 14 years. While Elara Ashvale stood at the precipice of her new reality, the fate of her father had already been sealed, according to the precise terms she had laid out before the Pack Council. Alpha Valerius Ashvale was not present for the final gathering. By her explicit decree, the powerful, silver-haired ruler who had once banished his own blood to protect his throne was subjected to a punishment far more absolute than death or exile. Alpha Valerius Ashvale's grand title was formally and permanently dissolved. The luxurious quarters he had occupied within the Longhouse were stripped of their royal tapestries, reduced to ordinary rooms assigned to commoners. He was granted no authority over the Pack's future decisions, no seat among the elders, and no ceremonial role within the territory he had ruled with an iron fist. Elara Ashvale had not locked him in a dungeon, nor had she spilled his blood upon the stone steps. Instead, she had stripped away the armor of his absolute power and left him entirely ordinary. In the quiet hours following her confrontation in the Great Hall, she had realized that taking his life would be an act of misplaced mercy. Alpha Valerius Ashvale had sacrificed his daughter and betrayed the memory of a vain Ashvale to preserve his sovereign authority. Therefore, removing that authority was the only accurate justice. What remained was merely an ordinary man, forced to live out the remainder of his days inside the very pack he had compromised, carrying the crushing weight of his past betrayals without a crown to hide behind. To Elara Ashvale, that living isolation was a far more profound sentence than any blade could deliver. As dusk settled over the territory, Elara Ashvale walked toward the Frostwood alone. She moved without a formal entourage, guided simply by an instinct she had trusted implicitly during her years of survival. The pack members dispersed into the soft, snow-fallen evening, leaving her to confront the boundary where her childhood had ended. She stood at the exact tree line where, at 6 years old, she had been abandoned to the elements. The black pines stood like towering sentinels against the pale twilight sky, casting long shadows into the deep wilderness beyond. It was the very spot where a terrified child had clutched a silver pendant, turning her back on the only home she knew to face an immense, indifferent cold. Elara Ashvale stared into the darkness between the ancient trunks. Elara Ashvale stared into the darkness between the ancient trunks. She waited for the familiar, suffocating grip of panic to seize her throat, but the air remained clear.
The fear was entirely gone.
She had come to this spot to take the final measure of her old wounds, and she found nothing but stillness. The forest was no less vast, and the northern winter was no less brutal, but she was no longer the defenseless girl who had been cast out. She had walked through the deepest shadows of the Frostwood and emerged on the other side as someone the dark could no longer claim. She had survived the worst the wilderness could offer, and in doing so, she had mastered it. The silver pendant rested quietly against her chest, no longer a heavy reminder of loss, but a symbol of enduring legacy. It carried her mother's hidden lineage, the royal claim of King Aldrich II, and 14 years of unyielding resilience encoded in its polished surface. It was finally at rest,
having accomplished the very purpose for which it had been preserved. The snow continued to fall around her, soft, patient, and clean, coating the stone-stepped longhouse and the surrounding ridges in a pristine white sheet. For the first time since her childhood was stolen from her, Alara Ashvale allowed herself to feel the simple, quiet reality of her own survival. It was not an overwhelming rush of triumph or a loud cry of vindication. It was a deeper, more permanent settling. The profound relief of a person who has carried an immense emotional burden across a continent and has finally, with both hands, set it down. The frostwood was dark, but Alara Ashvale was not afraid. She belonged to the wild now, and the wild belonged to her. The snow kept falling over the Iron Fang kingdom, unhurried and gentle, as though the northern sky itself had been waiting 14 years to finally get this part right.